Robert, welcome to Phoenix.
It's a pleasure to almost be there.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then we're going to hand it over to you for the first questions, maybe to give us kind of some input. You are looking at literally one of the most impressive individuals on Israeli and foreign policy involving the Middle East, literally in the world. He has an incredible background, and there's so much to say about him. But let me just do his introduction. Robert Satloff is the executive director of the Howard P. Burowitz Chair in the U.S. Middle East Policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. It's a Washington, D.C.-based think tank dedicated to advancing a balanced and realistic understanding of American interests in the Middle East. He is an expert on Arab Islamic politics as well as U.S. Middle East policy. Satloff has been with the Institute since 1993, steering its growth and ensuring its reputation for quality research and analysis on the region. He has authorized or edited numerous publications on the Middle East, including several books, reports, and articles covering a large range of political reforms to radical Islam and to the Arab-Israeli conflict. In addition to his leadership in the Washington Institute, Satloff is widely recognized for his extensive field work in the region, including trips to the Middle East countries where he has engaged with leaders and policymakers. He has frequently appeared as a commentator on major news outlets, offering insights on current events and U.S. policy in the Middle East. His work not only illuminates the complexities of the region, but also proposes constructive solutions to addressing ongoing challenges, making him a respected voice in both the academic and policy-making circles. His service awards, reflecting high esteem in which he was both the diplomatic and policy community. So, Robert, if I might, I'm going to start with the first question on this, and here's what I'm really interested in. If one thing seems clear to me, it's that we're losing the narrative. We're losing the narrative on what's going on this issue. Now, part of this was as a means to try to educate people. But if you look at TikTok today, overwhelmingly they're promoting the other message. If you look at what's happening on college campuses, we're losing the narrative. And I'd love to hear from you what you think we need to do to regain that narrative back.
It's a very powerful question, and I'm very happy to talk with you about this. One aspect of the narrative that we've lost, for example, has to do with the hostages. If these were hostages taken by Boko Haram, if they were taken by the Taliban, if they were taken by ISIS, then every American would know the names of the 5 Americans who are still languishing in horrible, inhumane conditions. But they're not. And I think virtually no Americans know the names of their fellow Americans who are being held by Hamas. This is, to me, a horrible tragedy that we have somehow devalued the hostages in general and the American hostages among them. It should be the top priority of the President of the United States to secure the release of Americans held hostage. Now, we have to remember, these were not people who voluntarily were in Gaza. These were people sleeping quietly in their homes, or people dancing at a music festival in another country, who were kidnapped, dragged across international lines to a separate political entity, to another country, and have been held by a foreign terrorist organization for now 200 days. This is beyond anything that has happened in our memory in terms of Americans held hostage. As horrible as the terrible story of the Wall Street Journal reporter in Moscow, he chose to go to Moscow. As horrible of the terrible story of the WNBA player who was held detained in Moscow, in Russia, she chose to go to Russia. It doesn't make it any less horrible. But these people were in their own beds in the country of an ally, ripped away. This story, this narrative that you referred to, is one that has been lost in all the noise and all the clamor about what has happened in Gaza over the last 6 months. So I think we need to make a concerted effort to remind our fellow Americans about these American citizens and all the others that are being held hostage, quite apart from the war, quite apart from the legitimate debates we have with other people about this or that aspect of the war. This isn't about the war. This is about Americans held hostage. And we have to reclaim that vital aspect of the story.
All right, so I'm going to let the first question go to Steve. But Steve, as you're asking the question, would you also answer one? Yeah, in my opinion, I've known you for a very long time. You're one of the best. You understand the PR marketing maybe better than anybody else, certainly in Arizona. Tell us what your thoughts are in terms of why are we losing this narrative?
I'll start with I don't know. But I do have a question that's tied directly to it. I think a lot of it has to do, and you know, we've had many of these discussions in our morning runs and whatever, as far as the polarization of the media. And if one particular media outlet is for something, then another media outlet has to be against something, against what the other is for, because they can't be for each other. And you've got such a polarization, and I'm not picking a side, I'm saying it's polarized on both sides. So I would suggest that if, and I'm just making this up, if Fox News comes out and says that that they want to talk a lot about the hostages and they're sympathetic to some degree, there's some in the other media that can't support what was said, so they show less of it, if you will. It's not that they're saying it's not true, they're just not talking about it. So, or if you're on a liberal media and they come out and say something, the conservative media, once again, has an issue with supporting that. And I think that that's something that's going on, which is hurting the narrative of what you're saying here, that right now, we have lost the narrative in terms of why people should be supporting Israel, and some of that has to do with the media itself, I think, is competing against each other. I'm speculating, I have no idea as far as if that's a cause of what's going on in terms of the specific here, but I do know the polarization overall of our media is a huge cause of what's going on with the split in our country. And if that's happening to our country, I'm sure it's happening with other issues outside of the country.
Your question.
I forgot. This is a tangential thing, but the nuclear narrative, what happens if Iran, how will Israel react the day that Iran gets a nuclear bomb? What's going to happen in your view? How will they react? What will the ramifications be?
Well, this is, of course, one of the biggest questions in the Middle East. If Iran actually achieves a nuclear weapons capability, then we've all failed. Remember, successive presidents of the United States, whether Republicans or Democrats, have all vowed that that is a line they will not allow Iran to cross. That they'll allow a lot of things, but letting Iran get a nuclear bomb, Trump, Obama, Biden, George W., they've all said the same thing, that it will not happen on their watch. So right away, that means 20 years of American presidents will have failed. As for Israel, I think we saw just last week them sending a message to the Iranians, which was very, very smart. The Israelis retaliated to the Iranian missile drone attack of April 13th by a small attack, which showed the Iranians that they have the means to evade all Iran's missile defense, all Iran's air defense, that they can go right to the source. They bombed a site very close to one of Iran's nuclear facilities. And the point was to convince the Iranians, don't go there. We have the capability of hitting you before you get what you want, before you get the bomb. So don't do it, because we will hit you. I'm quite sure that the Israelis will hit before the Iranians get a bomb. And frankly, I think that this might be the point where any American president will have to take military action, given that this has been a commitment as strong as any in American foreign policy, as strong as Article 5 to NATO. This commitment has been out there. We don't make these commitments very often, but this line has been drawn in the sand. And so if we reach the point that you just asked, then it will have been a massive failure that makes October 7th look like, a footnote in history.
All right, Henry, I'm going to come back to you. I want to ask just on that light, if I can. Let me ask two questions that maybe you can help us answer. The first one is, what other red lines do you believe that the United States government ought to be proposing to assure that we end up not having a nuclear-armed Iran, and to ensure that we have a greater chance for peace in the Middle East? The second question that I want to ask is, there are a lot of people who talk about the day after, where we talk about being upset with Israel because they don't have a plan for the day after they win. Not as if we had a plan for the day after we won with ISIS, but one of the things I'd really like to hear what your thoughts are, because I feel like you've been very fair to the Muslim world over a lot of issues. What I'd like to know is, what do you think the day after would look like if Hamas actually won the war?
Yeah, two and a half very good questions. First, on Iran, I think that we have, and this is successive administrations. This is a nonpartisan comment. We have convinced ourselves that Iran is a 10-foot giant, and that if we stoke the giant, oh my gosh, they're going to come after us, and it'll be World War III. I think we just learned, something that we should have known all along. Iran is not a 10-foot giant. We saw this with the 300 projectiles they sent toward Israel, 99% of which the Israelis and other allies were able to prevent. We should not deny ourselves the ability to get tough with Iran out of fear that the Iranians are somehow going to trigger World War III. If the Iranians kill Americans, which is what happened in the beginning of February when they attacked an American facility in eastern Jordan, we should have made Iran pay for it directly. And that will boost deterrence more than anything else that we can do in the Middle East. Now, in terms of the day after, and in terms of, you asked me what would happen if Hamas were to win, were to survive. This would be an absolutely horrible outcome. Horrible outcome not only for Israel, a horrible outcome not only for the Palestinians in Gaza. It would be a horrible outcome for all of our allies throughout the Middle East. They see Israel fighting for their interests, only slightly less than fighting for its own. They see that the war that Israel is waging against Hamas, to defeat Hamas, as something essential for the long-term survival of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Morocco, countries throughout the Middle East, basically more or less moderate countries with whom Israel has or wants to build peace. They see this as their war. And that's why you saw some of them 10 days ago actually shooting down those Iranian rockets. shooting down those Iranian drones. Now, let me add at least one more comment about the day after. Look, in terms of the specifics, I think there's a lot of loose talk out there. I do agree with the importance of having a vision that is part of the day after. And here, this is what I mean. People say, I think, quite stupidly, you can't kill Hamas because Hamas is not just an organization, it's an idea, and you can't kill an idea. Well, of course you can kill an idea. If we couldn't kill an idea, we'd have a world full of flat earthers. How did we kill the idea of the world not being flat? With a better idea, with scientists showing that the earth is round. Now, how have we historically, the United States, applied this basic principle? As we fought wars, we've had better ideas than our enemies from the very beginning. What's the Declaration of Independence? At the worst moment of our fight for freedom, it was a better idea than being a colony was to be free, that we came together and announced it. What was the Emancipation Proclamation at a dark moment of the Civil War? It was a better idea of freedom in the middle of that conflict. What did we do exactly 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, when the Japanese attacked us, not unlike what happened on October 7th with Hamas? People forget this, but it was essential. Franklin Roosevelt organized 40 countries to sign the first document declaring the future United Nations. Why? Because it was a better idea to counter fascism. That's what we do. We create better ideas. When people say a day after, what they're really suggesting is that we would like to work with Israel to offer a better idea than Hamas to the Palestinians. If we think of it that way, we can put it in the mindset that we Americans can understand from our own experience. And there are better ideas, because what Hamas offers is only death and destruction. And of course, there's a better idea out there, and we collectively should be trying to provide it. Because Hamas, of course, wants to kill any better idea, no less than killing the tragic victims of October 7th.
Professor.
Robert, thank you. Allow me to zoom out a little and ask you how global opinion and global democracy look from Israel's perspective at this point, because we know that, for example, during the Ukraine conflict, that global public opinion and global diplomacy did not really rally behind Ukraine in a way that some people might have wanted or expected, but that in particular the global south seemed to remain largely ambivalent towards the conflict, while Russia got support from China, North Korea, and of course Iran. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on global public opinion and diplomacy related to Israel right now, and what that has, the implications of that for Israel's standing in the world as this conflict draws to a close or drags on.
Yeah. So, look, Israel has a handful of allies, but regrettably, too much of global public opinion has been swayed against it. And, the imagery, the memory, the thought of October 7th has far too quickly faded and has been replaced with the constant daily imagery of human suffering in Gaza. When people forget why the Gaza war is happening, and people forget, something which is so perverse that it is very difficult to grasp. Hamas is fighting a war almost unlike any war we have ever seen in human history. It is not just that Hamas uses human shields. If you use human shields, you are indifferent to the fate of the shield. If that person dies, so be it. It's not necessarily that you want it, But if it happens, c'est la vie. But Hamas has a far worse strategy. It actually wants its civilians to be killed by Israel. Can one think of any other case in human history where one side wants its people to be killed precisely because, and this goes to your question, precisely because the more women, children, non-combatants that are killed, it advances Hamas's strategy. And it is working. We can see this. We can see the absurdity of South Africa taking Israel to the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice on charges of genocide. And the court ruling, not that Israel has committed it, but there is a plausible aspect to this. I mean, this is bizarre beyond belief, given what happened on October 7th and what triggered this conflict. But this is part of the perverse strategy. And we have to get our hands around the perversity, the sheer perversity is the best word that I can come up with to describe this, because we have so little experience with an army that wants its own people to die in order to achieve its strategic aims. And in the process, as you implied in your question, the global opinion has turned dramatically against Israel. Although we did see, it's not black and white. We saw on April 13th, when Iran attacked Israel, we saw not just those Arab countries who assisted, but we saw quite a lot of global support for Israel. In that, here Iran, out of the blue, sends 300 rockets and missiles to attack Israel. Nobody was cheering for Iran in governments. Maybe on, in the campuses of Columbia and Berkeley and NYU. That's a totally different universe. But in terms of Gaza, yes, Gaza, we have this enormous uphill battle to reclaim the origins of this war and to fight the perversity of Hamas's strategy.
Steve.
Well, I would question also, when you talk about the origins of the war, you're talking about the attack on the 7th, but the defense that's used by the other side often is, but they deserved what they got because for the last 10 years, everybody in Gaza has been so mistreated by Israel. Not true, obviously, but that is a narrative, and that's what you hear when you start talking about, they go, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen on the 7th, but if it did happen, they deserved everything they got because of all the mistreatment that's been going on before. So how do you defeat that argument and get the narrative back to where things should be?
Well, there's one level of response is fact. The fact is that the Israelis is that Gaza was the standard of living in Gaza was increasing. Israel was opening up its gates of employment to over 20,000 Gazans every day, coming into Israel to earn Israeli-level wages so that they could raise the standards of living for their families back in Gaza. That was the presumption that that Israel and Gaza, it may have been wrong, but the presumption was things were, going all right, that Gazans were going about their lives, many of them working in Israel, earning salaries, and it's not nirvana, but as far as this part of the world, that things were working just fine. The idea that Gaza was a hellhole, the idea that Gaza was a prison, the idea that people were starving in Gaza, that things weren't coming in, were not going out, simply not true. And there's an enormous well of evidence that one can cite. But the other part of the answer to the question is, even if you assume that what the argument is is accurate, which I don't, but even if you assume, then okay, attack soldiers. Fine, it's a war. Okay, fine. Attack a military base. Rape innocent women? Kill babies? Kill elderly people? Take infants hostage? What has that got to do with fighting for your freedom? Well, this is absurd. This is evil. This is vile. This isn't freedom fighting. This is pure evil. So there's two responses. One is the fact of the situation as of October 6th, and the other is the barbarity that has nothing to do with any legitimate fight for freedom, the barbarity of what happened on October 7th.
And a quick follow-on to that, supposedly some say that what was going on with Abraham Accords and the warming of relations with Saudi Arabia and Israel was a cause of October 7th as well, to some degree. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, I think October 7th was planned for quite a long time by the evil, devious mind of Yahya Sinwar. I mean, as a derivative benefit of October 7th, out of the catastrophic success of October 7th, there was additional pressure put on the Abraham Accord states. I don't think that was the principal purpose of October 7th. I think the principal purpose was to take the battle directly to the citizens of Israel and cause them to feel insecure in themselves and their own governments, out of a belief that you can actually, out of a belief by Sinwar, that you can destroy the Jewish state. I think he firmly believes this. The Israelis made a mistake on October 7th in terms of their defense. Hopefully they have recovered from their mistake and will, before this war is over, dismantle all aspects of Hamas's military and Hamas as a political entity, so that the real lesson will be felt by those who thought you could achieve what the head of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, thought you could achieve. But I don't think the stopping the Abraham Accords was the principal reason for what happened that day.
So I want to hit on the narrative and the Abraham Accords, and here's how I'll make that connection and ask the question. So to me, there are all these words that are about the propaganda to try to convince people that the United States and Western democracy are the bad guys. As an example, a multipolar world. That has this sense of why should one country be in charge of everything. Of course, they don't really mean that Turkey should have an equal say in all of this, and they don't really mean that Saudi Arabia should have an equal say in it. When they say multipolar world, they're talking about the United States, Russia and Europe, they're talking about China and Asia, and they're talking about Iran and the Middle East. The global South, less than 1/8 of the world's population lives in the global South. And if you want to talk about how do they see things, why don't you talk to Australia? That's in the global South, right? Or the concept of Asian thought. Asian thought is always collectivist. Really? Well, let's go talk to Korea and to Japan. They don't see things that way. Here's my question. The Abraham Accords certainly helps us with creating a strategic ally. But it seems to me that it also can be helpful in that narrative where we continue to break things up into parts that aren't necessarily true, like Muslims versus Jews. Thoughts on that?
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that I try to convince people about the Middle East is to understand that it is a mistake to think that there's one idea, that there's one principle which governs everything from Morocco to Iran, from Turkey to Yemen. Actually, these are countries with interests, just like countries with interests elsewhere in the world. And so you have a handful of countries. Now 5 Arab countries have made peace with Israel. They represent more than half of all Arabs in those 5 countries. Those 5 countries are Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. Then there are those countries that are opposed to peace with Israel in the Middle East. Some are Arab, some are just Muslim, like Iran is a non-Arab country, but is Muslim. But we should think about countries and their interests. We should not think about, as you say, these broad, ultimately meaningless principles, Asian thought, global South. I don't buy this. You look at countries, look at their interests, how to match their interests with your own and those of your allies, and we can build real partnerships if we understand that there's something in it for them and something in it for us. That's how you build win-win relationships. That's how you build real peace in the long run. Now, this doesn't mean that everybody in these countries, accepts the same thing, but it means that the leadership is committed, and we've seen, despite 6 months of losing the narrative, not one country with whom Israel has peace has suspended or ended their peace with Israel. Not one. We should take wins where we can find them, and this is a very positive development. Just think about 50 years ago, Arab-Israeli war, the Yom Kippur War. What happened within days of that war? All the Arab countries did a boycott and wouldn't sell oil to America because we were helping Israel. Is even one Arab country suggesting not to sell oil to the United States today? No, they all have their interest. The world is different than it was before. We should recognize it, understand where the problems are, and there are huge problems, and understand where states have interests. And that, if we can figure that out, then we can figure out some areas where we can actually solve problems.
Henry.
I'd like to ask you a question about the global economy and how it relates to the Middle East. You mentioned oil. One of the major features of the Middle East and its importance to global politics has been that they have been the major oil and gas exporter for decades. And yet in some of Israel's major allies, most notably North America, but also partly in Western Europe, we're seeing less of a dependence on oil and gas exports from the Middle East. On the one hand, because of increased gas and oil production in the United States, but particularly in Western Europe because of this transition away from fossil fuels towards electrification of automobiles and buses and all these things. How do you see that playing itself out in the future? Do you think that this transition towards away from fossil fuels towards more green electrification projects could shift the balance of power in the Middle East? And if so, would it work in Israel's favor or against Israel?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First is recognizing, as you just said, the enormous change that has occurred in terms of the oil market, who produces, who imports, who exports. Today, the Middle East is still an extremely important source of global energy, but it is principally for China. China is the main consumer of Middle Eastern energy today. China is the country that absorbs all of the illegal oil being exported by Iran, and China is the #1 purchaser of Saudi oil today. Actually, one of the great ironies is that the United States today, which patrols and preserves freedom of navigation in those choke points in the Middle East, the Bab el-Mandab, the Straits of Hormuz, one of the main beneficiaries of this is China. Now you're asking yourself, why are we providing security so the Chinese can purchase Arab and Iranian oil? Well, one alternative is to have China be the provider of security, which we really don't want. We would much rather be in a position where, in the moment of a global crisis, we can control those choke points, which is why we still today are the major maritime power in these critical choke points, even if we are not the beneficiary from the export of oil from that area. So there's enormous change. Now, if there were a full-blown green revolution, I think we'd see a few things. Israel would certainly benefit as a country which would be one of the leaders of the new energy and new technology society. There would be enormous domestic pressure on Arab countries with whom Israel is at peace. I think we should recognize that. Domestic pressure, upheaval in Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, etc. Because those countries, which, while they're trying to make an evolutionary change to a new economy, they still rely to a great extent on the old economy. And if the old economy no longer produces revenues, then they will be in big trouble. Actually, the story in Saudi Arabia today is, can it grow fast enough to stay ahead of the curve of the transition to the new economy? That is what MBS is trying to do by creating an economy that is not solely based on oil and gas. It's a gamble. We don't know. But I think we all have an interest that they succeed, because if they fail, then there will be an enormous instability right in the heart, right next door to Israel, right at the heart of this important part of the world. And we all, I mean, as much as we want this change to happen, instability is the brew in which conflict and war is likely to emerge.
So I'm going to hit one question first, Steve, before I go back to you. So Iran seems to be on a path to try to accelerate the acquisition of nuclear missiles. We also saw the missile attack that happened on Israel a few weeks ago. What I'd like to know from you is, what success do you think that sanctions have on that? And what are the risks and the benefits of creating real red lines for Iran?
Well, first of all, I'm a strong advocate of having clarity on Iran and Iran's nuclear program. I think that we need to not just be clear if Iran goes beyond a certain level of enrichment, or if Iran attempts a certain technical pursuit of weaponizing a ballistic missile with a device, that there would be, clear and immediate military action against Iran. I think we need to show Iran how serious we are. We need to make them understand the gravity of these commitments. I have no problem. Actually, I think we should be much less vague. The old line, all options on the table, doesn't cut it. We have to be much clearer, much firmer with the Iranians. In terms of sanctions, sanctions have an impact, but they have to be enforced to have an impact. So right now, for example, there are sanctions on the books that are not being enforced. And the critical ones have to do with oil. There is it's American law about stopping Iran's oil exports, and that would require that we sanction those Chinese companies, Chinese freighters, Chinese refineries, Chinese oil companies that are purchasing this Iranian oil. Now, there's a quiet understanding that we won't do that. We won't do it because it will complicate U.S.-China relations at a moment when we are trying to maintain a level of calm so that we don't have heightened tensions in Asia. And we won't do it because we don't want to spike global oil prices and send gas at the pump past what in the East Coast would be $5, but it might even be more out there in Arizona. So we don't enforce these sanctions. So sanctions would work. We saw that sanctions have compelled Iran to make policy changes in the past. We have those same sanctions on the books now, but we're just not enforcing them.
Steve?
You had mentioned just a moment ago we need to be more direct with what we will do if with Iran if they should cross a red line. What exactly do you mean when you say we should be direct? What should we be saying to them? That we're going to take care of it, we will come into your country and we will bomb the nuclear facilities, we'll turn a blind eye as Israel does that. What specifically do you mean?
Look, as I said earlier, at least 4 successive American presidents have made a commitment about the Iranian pursuit of a nuclear weapon. Here, this is not just us turning a blind eye to Israel. That is not leadership. That's not what the great, what the global superpower does when presidents make these commitments. I think we should be clear that if Iran crosses a certain line in the pursuit of a nuclear weapon, that their nuclear infrastructure will be destroyed. We have the capability. It will not start World War III. Clarity on this issue will ensure that Iran does not try to cross that line.
Henry?
10 years ago sounds like a long time. It's actually when I finished my PhD, which makes me also feel old. 10 years ago, there was a lot of talk of democracy in the Middle East. The Arab Spring was underway. There had been the demonstrations in Egypt, the fall of Mubarak's government there. There'd been the demonstrations in Tunisia and a transition to democracy there. And there were murmurs that there might even be demonstrations and transitions in other places, Syria and Bahrain and other places. Do you see any chance for regime change in any of these countries in the Middle East that we're talking about here as having a real negative trajectory, whether it's Iran or Syria or any of these other countries? Is there any chance that there could be an organic domestic movement for democracy that really changes the game in the region to the benefit of Israel and regional stability and peace?
So here I'm what I call a long-term, a strategic optimist, that in the long term, I think the answer is yes, but not in the near term. I mean, what happened with those experiments in democratic practice you referred to? They were hijacked by Islamic extremists. That's what happened in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood emerged as the main beneficiary of the fall of Mubarak. That's even what happened in Tunisia when the Ennahda, which is basically the Tunisian Muslim Brotherhood, emerged as the main beneficiary of the fall of their government. We saw this phenomenon spread across the Middle East, that Islamic extremists were crowding out Democrats, crowding out liberals, traditional term liberals, not the American way we think of it, were crowding them out and were essentially doing domestic political coups to take advantage of the chaos of this democratic moment. This is what opened up many of these countries to, return to strong arm rule, which is what we see now in Egypt with the military, and what we see now in Tunisia with a authoritarian leader. I don't believe that Arabs are congenitally incapable of having democratic government. What I do believe is that we, the United States, did not do a good enough job, and many Arab governments in those early days did not do a good enough job of insisting that democratic principles, that democratic free open expression, that rights, that process was maintained. We did not advocate on behalf of those people who share our values. We did not advocate on behalf of, small d Democrats who appreciate limited government, who appreciate individual rights, who appreciate personal freedoms. We need to do more than just call for the demise, the collapse of an old regime. This comes back to that earlier notion I mentioned of a better idea. If you're only going to advocate for the collapse of a bad regime, but not advocate for a better idea, then the vacuum gets filled by all sorts of bad ideas. And that's what happened with the Arab Spring, where the bad ideas of Islamic extremism often filled the vacuum that was left by the downfall of old regimes. We need to do better when the moment becomes again right, and we need to provide opportunities for people a lot more sympathetic to the ideals that animate our democracy, individual liberty, freedom, not the fascism of Islamic extremism.
So I want to really dig in on this question because to me, that's a key. We spent time on this panel talking about the idea of universal values and ideals and things that work and things that don't work. It seems to me, even if we defeat Hamas, if we allow back into place a government in Gaza that doesn't have civil rights, equal rights, human rights, that doesn't have property rights, that doesn't ensure the right of somebody to own a business and to not have it taken from them, one that doesn't have free elections, that their chances of success are very minimal. I mean, they're not like Saudi Arabia. I don't think they're going to discover oil there. They're not going to be able to be subsidized by some natural resource. The only resource they have is a lot of people. And Israel has shown us how to utilize a lot of people in a way in which you engage the individual. I've heard you talk about, I love this concept, I believe it was profit before the two-state solution plan, but you needed to get people back to being prosperous first. And it seems to me that those ideals that you're talking about are essential. So what would you see as being a plan that could actually, after this all is over, that we could put into place that actually might be able to help the people of Gaza become prosperous?
See, I think it's possible. I mean, I know so many Palestinians who are entrepreneurial in spirit, creative, want to build a better society. Yes, there are many who are stuck in old think. There are many who are, enthralled with these images of, Islamic extremism advocated by Hamas. There are many who are stuck in the corruption that has, too long plagued the Palestinian Authority. But we should not overlook the enormous number of Palestinians who really do want to create a prosperous, vibrant, vital society. And once Israel succeeds in dismantling Hamas's military and dismantling Hamas as a political entity, it would be, I think, beneficial if we, those Arab countries that are committed to this, and I include the Emirates and the Saudis and the Jordanians, the Moroccans in this effort, who have both entrepreneurial know-how and financial acumen, financial resources, to empower and invest in that part of Palestinian society that is waiting for an opportunity to build a better alternative. They need, we have to ensure the demise of Hamas to do this. Hamas, the Israelis did an experiment last month where they wanted to empower local clans in Gaza to distribute humanitarian resources. And so they invited the local clan leaders, the tribal leaders in Gaza, to step up and take responsibility to do this. Well, Hamas shot dead the leaders, the sheikhs of the two most significant clans in Gaza. That's because Hamas is not yet been dismantled. Only when Hamas is dismantled can this alternative really take root. So we should talk about the vision now, finish the job, and then do what needs to be done to build this alternative.
All right. Anybody in the audience have a question they're dying to ask? Yes. Oh, wow. I have a couple of them. I'll tell you what. What to do with the Houthis? I'm going to ask three of them. What to do with the Houthis? What was your question? Yes?
My question is there a way to reform the region by applying the principles of denazification that were used to eliminate Nazism from Germany?
Okay, I'm going to summarize these three questions. One was, did we underestimate the Iranians and the authoritarian government? The second question was, could we implement a strategy like we did with denazification, where they started with trials and they made certain that they held people accountable, but we also took over the governments.
No, it wasn't the trials, it was beyond the trials, it was the 10 or so governments, the different capabilities came in and reformed different aspects of the German society.
Right, we reformed the entire society, both in Germany and Japan, MacArthur and Japan. And then the last question was, what do we do with the Houthis? If you could try to think or give us an answer to those three questions, we'll make this almost the last one.
Okay, so I'll try to be brief. Iran, did we underestimate the authoritarian nature of the Iranian regime? I don't think we've underestimated them, in the sense that this is one of the most brutal dictatorships on the face of the earth. Actually, if we've underestimated anything, I think we've underestimated the depth of popular opposition to this regime. We should recognize that tens of millions of Iranians want change. Now, we're not going to send in the 82nd Airborne to implement change, but there are different ways that we can strengthen those voices who want change in Iran. We can provide them with internet technology that the Iranian regime cannot monitor. We should be providing them with resources to organize. We should be providing them with moral support. There's lots of things we can do to help chip away at the authoritarian regime in Iran. But I think we pretty much understand that these are bad guys. The Houthis. The Houthis, look, there's different aspects of this question. If you're asking me, are there things that we can do to stop the Houthi effort to undermine maritime trade in the Red Sea? The answer is absolutely yes. We've begun. I think there's a lot more we can do. One thing that I wouldn't mind doing is taking out an Iranian spy ship, which is in the Red Sea. It provides intelligence to the Houthis. Another thing that I think we ought to do is put a cordon around Yemen to deny Iran the ability to resupply the Houthis. I think there's a lot more that we can do to deny Iran's resupply of the Houthis. So I think we've just scratched the surface of things we can do to stop the Houthi missile attacks against shipping in the Red Sea. If your question is about should we take on the Houthis and what they're doing in Yemen, this is one of these local fights that I don't think I don't think we want to be dispatching American troops to fight a war after the Saudis and the Emiratis gave up on themselves trying to stop, to undermine, to get rid of the Houthis. I think our major interest is to deny the Houthis the ability to affect Red Sea shipping. And there, I think we need to be a lot more assertive. Now, in terms of your denazification question, first of all, we got to get our pronouns right. The issue is really having to do not with we, but with the Israelis. They're the ones who were the principal victims of October 7th. They're the ones fighting the war against Hamas right now. They're the ones that will have this entity as their neighbor in perpetuity. I mean, you can, some things you can change in life. You can't really change geography. You can't really change demography. And so the issue is really for them less so for us. I personally would love to see trials of perpetrators of October 7th. I think it would have an enormously salutary benefit, not just a cathartic benefit for Israelis, but an educational benefit for Palestinians and Arabs more generally. I don't like, I should say, I don't like using terms like denazification. I don't like using the Holocaust metaphor to apply to anything other than the Holocaust. As horrible and as as gut-wrenching as October 7th was, it was a terrible day, not a terrible 6 years, not a terrible 9 years. It was not a terrible decade. It was a terrible, horrible day. And I personally don't like using the Holocaust metaphor for what happened on October 7th. It was bad enough that we don't have to connect it to what happened at the darkest moment in human history. So I think there are things that can be done, but again, I come back to the importance of offering a different alternative, which is ultimately what happened in Europe and Japan, a democratic alternative, an alternative that was modeled on something very different than what Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany had before their defeat. And that is what comes the day after victory. And so I firmly believe in the importance of success in this war and in having a better idea for what the Israelis, and with our help, what they can do to build a better future in the area.
All right, this is my last question, and this is really a comment about personality that I'd like to know. You are definitely one of the preeminent spokesperson for the Jewish community. You have people, I love the idea that overwhelmingly, once and again, you pick out people from the Republican administration and the Democratic administration and put them into the Washington Institute. You certainly, a lot of people respect and look up to you, but here's what I found to be interesting. You wrote this book where you talked about Arabs during the Holocaust who saved Jews. Now, it's a great story all by itself, but I want to know why. Why did you write that story?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, I wrote a book called Among the Righteous, which tells the story of what happened in Arab countries during the Holocaust, with a special focus on those Arabs who saved Jews during the Holocaust. Why did I write it? I wrote it because too many. Look, I wrote it because we have historically two ways that we talk to the Arabs about the Holocaust. One is it's a faraway story of what happened in Europe, which most Arabs could care less about. And so they turn off right away and they end up listening to their local preachers and Islamic extremists who tell them, something very different. Or the other way that we talk to Arabs about the Holocaust is we recite back to them all the terrible, nasty, horrendous things that that various Arab leaders and public figures have said about the Holocaust, about the Jews doing it to themselves, the Jews forcing the Nazis to kill them, horrible, terrible things. And we don't actually have a conversation with Arabs about this. I think it's this one of the most important moments in human history. And so I racked my brain to come up with a way to engage Arabs in a conversation about the Holocaust that would be meaningful for them. And so I asked a question: did any Arabs save any Jews? Because if Arabs, if even just one, saved a Jew during the Holocaust, then we would have a totally different lens through which to have this conversation. It's not the only lens. It doesn't tell the entire story, because we know that Arabs were perpetrators, just like Arabs who were rescuers. But it gives us a new platform to engage this entire universe of people, to have a civil, meaningful, open, human conversation about this most important of issues. And that's why I wrote this book.
Robert Satloff, you're not only a great leader, you're a great man. Thank you very much.
No,
We
you don't know
appreciate
me
you
well
being
enough, but thank you very much.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.